afternoon to our viewers from Europe. Welcome to today's version of NAVI Speaker Series with the renowned author Elisabeth Braw. We are very lucky and happy to host Elisabeth today in this Monday morning and Monday afternoon in Europe. So I am Dr. Ibrahim Kocaman. I am an assistant professor at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. I teach security studies and international affairs. I'm also head of security and defense policy studies at NAVI Research Institute. So I'll briefly introduce Elisabeth before turning it over to Hassan, so he will introduce himself as well. Elisabeth Braw is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Transatlantic Security Initiative, focusing on geopolitics and the globalized economy, as well as the new national security threats. She's also a columnist with Foreign Policy and Political Europe, and the author of the groundbreaking new book, Goodbye Globalization, The Return of a Divided World, which was published by Yale University Press this year. And just a little bit of an update about the book, Goodbye Globalization just won gold in the Axiom Business Book Awards last week. So congratulations, Elisabeth, on that award. Elisabeth was previously a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and a senior research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London. She's also the author of many other very interesting books, such as God's Spies, about the Stasi's Church Division, which was published in 2019, and The Defender's Dilemma, Identifying and Deterring Gray Zone Aggression in 2022. She's also a member of Gallows Technologies Advisory Board, a member of the UK National Preparedness Commission, a member of Aurora Forum's Steering Committee, and an advisor to Willis Towers Watson's research arm. Before joining academia, she worked in the private sector, following a career as a journalist. She's a regular op-ed contributor to the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Times of London. So thank you so much for being with us today. I will briefly turn it over to Hassan so he can introduce himself and also talk about our book give-outs. Hassan, over to you.
I'm Hassan Selik. I'm an assistant professor of management at Robert Morris University and head of emerging technologies and data studies at NAVI. And we have great news for you today. We are gonna give out 5 copies of this book, as you see in Ibrahim's hand. And we will have a lottery among our event participants, and then we will have another lottery for the rest of the books among our followers, sharing this event on their social media accounts. And we will reach out to them and then the winners and then get their addresses to ship their books.
All right, thank you so much, Hassan. Before asking our first question to Elisabeth, let me just talk about timing a little bit. We're planning to spend about 45 minutes asking our questions to Elisabeth about her book and some other related subjects. And we are planning to use the last 15 minutes or so for Q&A. So during our talk, please feel free to pose your questions on the Q&A and also share your location and your name, so that you can enter to draw for three free books. So to start with, I guess, Elisabeth, it would be the best way to start with, I guess, would be, can you tell about your main argument in this? You basically argue that globalization is declining, and you even also argue that it's globalization as we know it might be over. So why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about details of your your main argument and what made you to write this book?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, thank you for organizing this, and I love your brilliant concept for the lottery. That's exactly the way to do it. Yeah, congratulations in advance to those who emerged lucky from these 2 lotteries. So I decided around 2021 that I wanted to write this book, and that was because I've been hearing an increasingly growing number of people telling me, people in the business community, essentially executives, telling me that something fundamental was shifting within the globalized economy. China was becoming less safe to do business in. They were getting concerned about Russia as well. Who wasn't getting concerned about Russia? But what mattered from a globalization perspective was that business executives were getting concerned about Russia. And I've been hearing that for around 5 years, but increasingly loud concerns. Of course, business leaders won't go to the media and say, "Oh, globalization is ending," but they are not, and they are not political. They make decisions based on conditions on the ground. And what I was hearing was that it was something fundamental was shifting. And then I started writing the book in 2022. Early 2022, and then of course a few weeks into that, Russia confirmed my thesis. And what matters about that is that what Russia did by invading Ukraine was essentially telling the world, increased prosperity, participation in the globalized economy is not our top priority, or is not the top priority of the leadership. Invading Ukraine is a top priority. You can say it's a crazy top priority, but they are the Russian leadership, they get to choose, and that's what they chose. And what we saw in China around that same time was that the government, the authorities, crack down on business in an unprecedented way, and not just on Western businesses, which are being subjected to various acts of retaliation when their government did or said something that the Chinese government didn't like. And we saw, for example, well, we have seen in the past 3 or 4 years, Australian winemakers being targeted, Taiwanese pineapple farmers, the entirety of the Lithuanian economy, Ericsson, and the Chinese government could do that because globalized businesses that trade with China are an easy target. But then the Chinese government started cracking down on Chinese businesses too, specifically Jack Ma and other tech titans. And by doing that, the Chinese government demonstrated that it too doesn't have global participation in the globalized economy, increased trade, increased prosperity for its citizens. That is not its top priority. Its top priority is retaining power, and it's willing to sacrifice essentially the trust and faith of the business community in order to stay in power. So those two things, those two developments were really accelerating. And what we have seen the past, certainly the past 4 years, and maybe even in the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years, is an increasing loss of faith in the globalized economy. And that's what matters. We won't see that resulting in radically different trade figures within a very near future, because it takes a long time to shift your operations from one country to another. And by the way, it's not as if countries will retreat into autarky. That's not what it is about. It's the loss of faith in globalization, meaning trade with the whole world, regardless of ideology. And so the departure of Russia and China from that close collaboration with Western economies, that really matters, and that's what makes this shift so important. So I'll cede the floor to you, but that's why I wanted to write the book. And I think it's so important to remember that these indications that something is changing, that will only be noticeable in statistics after it has happened. What the first indications are the ones you get from people on the ground, from business leaders who essentially say, well, something is shifting. We are going to have to take action.
So I know Hassan will have a question about your globalization, but definition of globalization. But before, sorry, Hassan, before we move into that, I wanna follow up just the last sentence that Elisabeth had. So and that's where I want to bring in the methodology that you use in this book. So Hassan and I happen to be quantitative researchers, and we usually depend on quantitative data on our own research. And I mean, I have research interest in political economy, but many pieces, many research pieces that I read, look, even if they use qualitative interviews or surveys, they do these surveys to either hire executives of CEOs or companies or policy-making people. But what I see, I'm just looking at your list of interviewees just to verify I'm not making a mistake. I think you have about 40, if not exactly 40 people that you interviewed for your book, and they are from all walks of life, including high school students, including former former Homeland Security Secretary from the US, a lot of other politicians, high-level CEOs, entrepreneurs, and academics like us, policymaking people. And I must say, I have thoroughly liked and enjoyed the diversity that you have, and your and most of the other takes on globalization used to have a lot of institutional focus, but like you decided to focus on every walks of like people from every walks of life, including and maybe the most remarkably ordinary citizens. How like maybe like I know it was a little long story, but how did you come up with like what made you decide to use this methodology rather than what we have been seeing in other books?
Yeah, globalization really is something, I'm going to say a development that has touched almost every single person on this planet in some way. So if you're going to write a book about globalization, you have to hear from people. I think that to me, that must be the basis. And so people who helped build globalization, helped make decisions about globalization, but also people who have been impacted by globalization in good or bad ways. And we should remember that these people, especially those who have been affected, so essentially impacted in a negative way, they around 2016 started making their views known, and you can say they conflated the elite and globalization and general resentment. But the point was that they saw globalization as a force that had done harm to their lives. And you can say, well, that is crazy. We have all benefited, at least in developed economies, we have all benefited from globalization. It's crazy to say that an alternative would be better. Yes, we have benefited because we have at our disposal now cheaper goods, and it really is extraordinary how cheap goods, consumer goods, have become thanks to globalization. But if people don't feel that they've benefited, that argument is not going to help. You're not going to be able to convince people that globalization is a good thing if they say, well, here in my community, we used to have so and so many factories, or a large factory that employed so and so many people. Now that factory is no longer here. Now, it may have departed or closed for a variety of reasons. So part of it may have been globalization. They moved from, say, Western Europe to Eastern Europe, or Western Europe to China. It could parts of it could be due to automation. But nevertheless, what matters is in a democracy what people think, and if they think that globalization is the force to blame, or the aspect to blame, then they would do so, and that's what Donald Trump realized. I don't think he is particularly, I mean, he's not a scholar of globalization, but he realized that there was a lot of resentment among American voters in communities that had essentially lost out in various ways, seen their factories leave, and he realized that he could win a lot of support by blaming globalization, by focusing on these voters, by blaming globalization, and he was very successful doing so. So you've got to listen to people of all walks of life, even if they are so-called ordinary citizens that may not be influential. Well, they will be influential if they gather together the ballot box. And so, but my point is also that it's just fascinating to listen to people, right, and hear how they experience globalization. It's I'm of the firm conviction that everybody has something interesting to say, and I hope in this book I've been able to demonstrate that even so-called ordinary people have something interesting to say. about globalization, and it just makes it, I think, a lot more readable if you hear from people. If you essentially see globalization, treat globalization as something that involves people as opposed to an abstract subject.
Yeah, great. I mean, great choice. Like you rightfully say in your book, that the benefits of globalization have been underappreciated by the general public, and it matters to understand why people thinks that way. Yeah, so great choice. So Hassan?
Yeah, Elizabeth, you mainly focus on, China's undemocratic political stance, as well as Russia's belligerence since 2008. I'm gonna come to that point to make you, elaborate on more on this, on these two countries' behaviors and approaches. Before that, I want to make sure you are gonna evaluate the dimensions of globalization. As you know, there are several dimensions of globalization, such as political, economic, socio-cultural, technology, and security and defense. So what is your observation? What are your observations in terms of these dimensions? Do we see a deglobalization trend in each dimension, or we see in some of them, we don't see in some of them? So what would be your evaluation?
So you mean in various business areas, right?
Various dimensions, I mean, not just business, but as I said, technology, socio-cultural,
Yep.
security and defense.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, it's extraordinary what we're seeing, and thank you for that question, Hassan, because it's not just about businesses. We are seeing, for example, universities in the West all of a sudden becoming much more concerned about foreign researchers, or essentially master students and higher, coming to their universities. It used to be an unmitigated good, and the two of you are academics, you'll know what it's like, and I would think others on this call are academics as well. It used to be seen as an unmitigated benefit, and academia is by definition international, right? And all of a sudden, or I shouldn't say all of a sudden, slowly, universities and, more importantly, policymakers have realized that some countries are exploiting the openness of our universities to get access to our best innovation and essentially turbocharge their own economy off the back of the innovation that goes on in our universities. And the main perpetrator there, of course, is China. And it's a massive dilemma. What do you do in an academic environment where academia remains international, and the idea is to collaborate across borders, but all of a sudden, gradually, it's becoming clear that one country is using that openness to essentially take a lot and not give back in equal measure. And it has been the case for centuries that some scientists have essentially benefited more from collaboration than they've put into it, but it was individual cases, right? What do you do when a country systematically does that? And in some countries, especially the UK, you have the added complication that universities depend on the funding that these master students bring by virtue of their tuition fees, and that's the doctoral students and especially postdocs bring through research funding. So universities depend on these Chinese representatives for the financial well-being, but yet for the country, the harm that the accumulated loss of IP results in is a massive national security dilemma. What do you do about that? And it's very hard to figure out, and governments have been struggling now, Western governments have been struggling for a few years now to figure out what to do. And I think for academics, they say, "Oh, I'm an academic. I can accept that, a certain amount of IP leaves my lab, and why should I care about the national security?" And so governments have to make the case to universities that you, as a university, should care about national security and should essentially forego these the collaboration, potentially forego the collaboration with certain Chinese representatives, be it master students or all the way to postdocs, for the sake of the country. Well, that's a completely new argument that universities have to deal with. So that's one area. Then another area is defense manufacturing. So as part of globalization, we also outsourced critical parts of the defense supply chain. And just the other day, the CEO of Saab pointed out that it is very difficult to make ammunition here in the West because we depend on gunpowder from China. Well, what if China decided to no longer export gunpowder to us, or to only export to certain countries in the West? So globalization, really, it was all encompassing, and we thought, it's what's not to like, and it's specialization is the name of the game, and everybody benefits and lower costs and so forth. And now all of a sudden, that turns out to be a massive vulnerability. And as I said, on the academic side, that is a Gordian knot that governments and universities will, I think, be struggling to solve for a long time, because there are competing interests. Over.
Okay, now let's delve more into the China's, anti-democratic and undemocratic, and now it is kind of belligerent political stance, as well as Russia's belligerency since 2008. Could you please clarify more on these two, countries?
Yeah. So when Russia fought its war against Georgia in 2008, most businesses didn't care. I mean, this war came and gone went within days, and businesses, I think, international businesses, Western businesses operating internationally, and indeed all businesses, are used to various hiccups. They know that if outside liberal democracies, you will have various crises and contingencies, and that's just the way it works, and you keep going because it is commercially advantageous to be present in that country. So the Georgia war came and went, then the annexation of Crimea came and went, and Western businesses stayed in Russia because they said, well, it's basically okay to operate here. And it wasn't until in the late 2010s that they started getting really concerned, again, not for political reasons, but just for reasons of political unpredictability, or business unpredictability. And for me, a key moment arrived in, I think it was 2020, when Mike Calvi was arrested. Now, I don't know whether Mike Calvi is known among your listeners. Probably not. He's an American businessman who is very well known in the business community, but not to the general public, but extremely successful in Russia. He has been operating there since the early 90s. He came there on an EBRD assignment, and then started a private equity company and did very well. And he was really the poster boy of Western business executives in Russia. He learned Russian fluently and operated there, and was able to keep going despite various hiccups. And he kept going even when others started saying, well, it's becoming less safe here, and we should reduce our exposure. He kept operating there, and he said, he even sort of made the case for Russia internationally, and he said, look at me, I'm still here. Well, then he was arrested, and that was such a pivotal moment, because that's how the regime demonstrated that nobody is safe. And he was then put on trial, and it was a very mysterious case brought by a rival, former business partner who had turned a rival and or become a rival, and essentially it was a business dispute. And the case was very flimsy. It went to trial. It was a long trial, and Mike Calvi was then sentenced to 5.5 years suspended. So not an insignificant sentence. Then when it comes to China, I think what we started seeing around 2016, 2017 was that it wasn't just, everybody's welcome to do business here and we'll create the perfect conditions. That was the case in the early 90s. Everybody could come there, open arms and so forth. But then by the late 2010s, some of the first companies that had come there, essentially the low technology manufacturers, some of the low technology manufacturers, garment, footwear manufacturers, they started feeling less welcome. And essentially, they were edged out of the country. And that's when it became clear to me that China is just never going to be a sort of a traditional market economy where you just do business because it's business. The government will want or does want to keep steering the economy to support national goals. And so clothing manufacturers, shoe manufacturers were no longer desirable because China was moving up the value chain. And then you started thinking, well, or I started thinking, well, if that is the case, which industry will it be that's next edged out of the country or considered not valuable enough? And on top of that, we of course had China's increasing tendency to punish Western companies as proxies for their home governments. And the first case, I remember it vividly because that's when I started paying attention to it. It was when a dissident named Liu Xiaobo won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010. And China didn't like it, and this man was in prison already, and China didn't like it. Well, how do you react, or how do you respond as China if the Norwegian Nobel Committee, which is an independent organization, awards the Nobel Prize to somebody you don't like? Well, what China did was suspend imports of Norwegian fish. Well, so Norwegian fishermen, they are geopolitically neutral. They don't have anything to do with Norwegian policymakers or indeed the Nobel Peace Prize. They were punished, and that's when I started thinking, who will be the next target? And then from essentially 2018, 2019, we started seeing an accumulating number of such cases.
So thank you so much for that explanation. I think you make it really clear in the book that, as you point out, globalization really took off after the end of Cold War in the 90s. And the basic hope was that, as you say, like the globalization's basic premise was goods versus soldiers. If goods cross borders, soldiers may not. And we in the West kind of hoped that opening up the non-Western countries to free markets, integrating them to the free market, would also bring about liberal democracy, which, as the students of conflict know very well, the basic premise of the democratic peace theory: if there's more democracy out there, there will be less conflict. But you point out that it was like mainly decision of powerful countries like Russia and China to not couple market economies with liberal democracy, and they actually did even more than that. And like you say, they used the advantages that globalization brought to them to induce vulnerabilities on the West. But this was not the only reason why you argue globalization is faltering. It also has a lot to do with the citizens, like unhappiness of the citizens in the West about the idea that globalization actually underdelivered. And we will talk about those social dimensions, climate change and Gen Z. But before we do that, do you also think, as far as the public at large in West is concerned, do you also think the rise of right-wing political movements and populism across the globe, most notably in Europe, has anything to do with this retreat from globalization?
So I think some of these radical movements are a result of globalization, not of globalization itself, but of the fact that people feel they were not consulted. Globalization just happened. It was executed by politicians and business leaders, and the people, the public was never asked if that was something that they thought was a good idea. And I've thought several times, what would have been the outcome if Western countries had had referenda about whether they should globalize or whether they should well, all countries, but especially Western countries, whether they should further expand and build globalization. And what if there had been a referendum in each country that listed the advantages and disadvantages of building globalization, essentially expanding to Central and Eastern Europe, China, and Latin America, and even Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East? What would people have voted in such a referendum? And of course, it's a counterfactual. These referendums never happened, but it's interesting to think about, because the question was never put to the public. Do you think this is a good idea? It just happened because those in charge, policymakers and business leaders, saw that it was an unmitigated advantage. We'd get cheaper goods, we'd be able to do more with countries that had been our adversaries, build friendships, build better relations, and build global peace, right? What's not to like? Well, if you don't consult citizens at home, they will grow resentful. And I think one thing that really should have happened is that at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where the titans of globalization have been gathering for years, they should have invited ordinary citizens. That would have given them an early indication of where the public stood long before Trump won the election, long before the UK voted in favor of Brexit. And that didn't happen. And also, it's not the case that globalization alone is to blame. But if people feel that globalization alone is to blame, even though it's, there are additional factors like the arrogance of maybe their political elite or the arrogance of their business leaders, then it doesn't matter that they may be mistaken. It's their perception that matters, and they will act on that perception.
Great. So you basically argue that it was actually a mutually reinforcing process between what globalization brought about and what people actually thought about it.
Exactly. And then, Ibrahim, the extraordinary thing is that the loss of faith in globalization came from several directions at basically the same time in the late 2010s. So ordinary citizens at home in the West, China becoming more repressive and towards the private sector in general, and using using Western companies as proxies for the home governments, essentially weaponizing globalization, and then Russia becoming more belligerent. All of that happened at the same time, independently of each other, and it essentially created this momentum against globalization that has resulted in a rapidly accelerating loss of faith in globalization. And it's interesting to see no politician in this election year 2024 will campaign on a platform saying we need more globalization.
Yeah, definitely, Elizabeth. You are absolutely right about the perceptions, and perceptions, matter. When it comes to the global economy, I think we need to discuss the global supply chains. And you said you have started, observe these type of, indications, cues into 2020. And it, coincides with the eruption of COVID-19 pandemic as well. And we have seen many disruptions due to the, pandemic. Therefore, countries, companies started to, take precautions to improve their supply chain resiliency and their organizations, benefits. So what were the main shifts for the global supply chains?
Yeah, COVID, I should have mentioned that earlier, so thank you for bringing it up. COVID really was a massive wake-up call for two reasons. The first reason was, or the first part of it was that all of a sudden, people around the world, so-called ordinary people and policymakers realized that the Chinese government's being transparent. And I don't think most ordinary people had any views on whether the Chinese government could be trusted. It's, yeah, why should you have an opinion about that? Then after COVID erupted, it was a year after that, opinion polls in the West showed skyrocketing and percentages of people saying, I don't trust China, or I don't trust the Chinese government, or I don't trust Xi Jinping. So, and it doesn't matter where the virus came from. That's not the point. What matters is that the Chinese authorities obfuscated early on, and that led to the spread, the uncontrolled spread of the virus within Wuhan. And then as a result of globalization, it spread very quickly from Wuhan to first Italy, because people traveled back and forth for business between Wuhan and Italy. And that's how it spread, right? And then it's interesting to think about, what would have happened if COVID had emerged before globalization was in place. Would it have spread in this way? And I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have. But be that as it may, it did spread, and it also had an effect not just on people's perception of China and the Chinese government, but an immediate effect on businesses. And I don't know about you, but I remember vividly the absolute struggle in the UK, which is where I was living at the time, to get PPE, and there was no PPE to be had, and because they had been all been outsourced to China, and China refused to increase production to help us get PPE when we needed it. So it became obvious, I think, to everyone that we were dangerously dependent on China. And with PPE, it's okay because factories at home can essentially reconfigure themselves and start producing PPE pretty quickly. But if it's something more complex than that, and most things are more complex than PPE, then you can't reconfigure quickly. You essentially, you're stuck. And it wasn't just a shortage of PPE, it was also the fact that zero COVID in China's zero COVID policy essentially caused factories to shut time after time whenever there was a COVID case. And even German manufacturers started saying, well, this is unsustainable. Every time there's a COVID case, our supply chain is disrupted. And that's not to say that the German companies essentially gave up on China. No, but what did happen was that they concluded that their heavy dependence or exposure to China in their supply chains, not just through their own manufacturing, but in their supply chain, brought vulnerabilities. And Hassan, I think an interesting thing about supply chains is that you don't know where your vulnerabilities are until the crisis strikes. Because when everything works fine, you don't really think about it, and you may not even know all the companies that are in your supply chain. But when there is a crisis, you discover it very, very clearly, and it becomes a massive problem. And that really was a wake-up call when companies realized that our exposure to China really is unhealthy. And a good and then I'll give the floor back to you. But I think a good pre-warning of that was the Fukushima incident in 2011, which was obviously a natural disaster. And one of the companies that had to shut because of the radiation and general risk created by the Fukushima incident was a manufacturer of a certain type of car pigment or paint. Pigment that is used in car paint, and essentially the shiny part in that is used in car paint. And so that meant that Western car manufacturers had to suspend the delivery of those cars, and just because they had only been using single source, because why would you use anything under the single source when it works so well? And so they, as a result of Fukushima, became better prepared, but no companies were fully prepared for COVID, and it was a brutal experience to essentially be constantly disrupted and have no predictability about when and how you would be getting the components you needed.
Yeah, similarly, if you remember, we have been experiencing chip crisis, and therefore, because of that chip crisis, car manufacturers, have many problems in terms of manufacturing, their car production. So as you mentioned, we have problems with China. What about India, Vietnam, and other South Asian countries? Can they be alive fast and can practice, CPR on these type of issues?
And if I may add to that, since you mentioned this a lot, you mentioned friendshoring and decoupling from Russia a lot. So in terms of that, just like Hassan said, can you evaluate India's situation in terms of its ability to help with decoupling and friendshoring?
Yeah, so I don't think we'll see decoupling. I mean, it's just not possible. And even if policymakers and especially pundits, if they say, oh, we need to decouple, what they say has no effect. What matters is what business leaders think, and they make decisions on a commercial basis, right? So, but what we will see is friendshoring. The question is who will win in this friendshoring game, right? I mean, that this is an opportunity for countries that had essentially lost the race to China, because China became the world's factory. This is an opportunity for them to attract manufacturing. And the question is, how do you do it? And it's not going to be just one country. I think the main winner will be India. So India was always the almost winner of globalization, but it was almost, it always lost out to China, because China is just more efficient, more central decision making, and in India things were just a bit too chaotic for especially manufacturers to want to set up operations there. And now India is getting an unexpected second chance, but it's not going to be just India. So the big game that is on is which countries will be able to attract friendshoring, and they will have to team up in groups, so neighboring groups, something like the Philippines, Vietnam, and India together will have to sort of form a coalition to attract friendshoring. And there is so much that will have to work within that hub. The legal systems will have to be harmonized, transportation, logistics, and that is a massive undertaking. And in China, it's just there. So it is very complex. And for friendshoring companies, I mean, it's like moving house, but 1,000 times more complicated. And so when people say, oh, Western manufacturers haven't left China yet, yeah, it's because it takes a long time and it's extremely complex. So I think we'll see new hubs. Vietnam is already out there heavily positioning itself to get friendshoring companies. I think we'll see another hub around Mexico. So Mexico and essentially the relevant parts of the southern United States, maybe some other neighboring country. Montreal is also positioning itself for certain aspects, I think, EV batteries. And by the way, Turkey is another country that I know from business conversations keeps popping up. It's less expensive than Western Europe. It's also not oversaturated, and it could team up with countries in the region. And so what I think we'll see is a competition between various hubs, but of course they have to decide first to form hubs. It can't be countries competing individually, because no country will be attractive enough to attract serious friendshoring on its own. And then the last thing is that politically and when it comes to geopolitics and defense, they can't be on different sides. They will have to be essentially on the Western side, or at least neutral. So India, Vietnam are clearly not Western countries or Western allied, but they are not hostile to the West.
All right, thank you so much. And I think it's really in order for us to discuss about NATO, because it's been almost 45 minutes and we didn't even make a mention of NATO. So as the NATO Veterans Initiative, we want to talk about NATO. So how do you actually, not just NATO, but how do you actually situate military alliances around the world, most notably, obviously, since we're here within the context of NATO Veterans Initiative, NATO in that bigger picture that you draw to us? How do you think NATO will fare in what you call as diminishing globalization. I mean, as a political scientist, I can come up with like two kind of scenarios. NATO in the Cold War was like, you argue that we're going towards a divided world, just like we had in Cold War. So NATO was a product or like a very important organization in a divided world in the first place. So one side of me thinks that NATO might be even more relevant in the future in a divided world, this time led by China instead of the Soviets. But you also mentioned this trend of autocratic countries influencing democracies in the West. So if we start seeing more fractures in the Western alliance, could this render NATO less relevant? Like, how do you see NATO's future in wake of diminishing globalization?
Yeah, NATO is in a paradoxical situation. So with geopolitics returning, with the world becoming much more contentious, there is a growing role for NATO, specifically when it comes to defending its members against Russia. And then because there is no similar organization, for example, in Southeast Asia, people keep saying, well, NATO should do more to patrol in Southeast Asia to make sure that China doesn't expand its maritime aggression or maritime harassment there. And so NATO is in the unenviable position of essentially being the organization that every Western country turns to for every security need. But NATO is about territorial defense. It's not about territorial defense of its members. So everything else is not part of its task. And where that matters is, for example, with the Shadow Fleet, which is a direct outcome of the declining globalization. So Russia, by invading Ukraine, essentially told the world, we will accept being excluded from the globalized economy, which is what happened. But Russia didn't just then accept that, oh, we won't be able to export and import like we used to. They found alternative ways, and that alternative way is the Shadow Fleet. So a massive fleet that keeps transporting, especially Russian oil, to India and China and other recipients, and also brings goods to Russia. And that Shadow Fleet is not just doesn't just violate all kinds of maritime rules on which we depend for global shipping, which is the engine of the globalized economy. It also poses a danger to the countries through whose waters it sails. And in the past few weeks, there's been a lot of discussion about the Russian shadow vessels in the Baltic Sea. And the reason that matters is that the main ports for Russian oil are the Baltic Sea ports. So that means that the shadow vessels then travel through the waters of several NATO member states onto the Great Belt, which is in Denmark, where and it's very narrow waters, and they can have accidents at any point in these waters, accidental accidents, so to speak, or deliberately caused accidents. And that would cause considerable harm to these countries. And they would have to clean up, first of all, and then pay for the whole thing. But it's not a NATO task. I mean, NATO is about territorial defense. It's not about, its task is not to deter some oil tankers that may break down in member states' waters. And yet, this is, I think, a serious, these vessels can cause a serious harm to NATO member states, as can various weapons. So it's a confused situation, and it's totally unclear of what NATO can do about it.
Thank you, Elisabeth. As a follow-up question, is, how can veterans of NATO countries and non-governmental organizations like NAVI can help address these challenges posed by new era and shape the new security environment?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because it really is important for people who are involved with NATO, whether as employees or former employees or in the sort of surrounding orbit of think tankers, to not just exist within that orbit, but engage and be involved outside the NATO world. It's so easy to get comfortable so inside the NATO world, attend NATO-related conferences, sort of hear the same arguments over and over again, and agree that all that has been said is just brilliant. Well, there's a whole other world out there. For example, the business community, the world of new threats facing NATO member states, and NATO won't become irrelevant because it is relevant as the organization that defends the territory of its member states. But I think it risks becoming less relevant in the policy debates in outside NATO circles if those who are involved with NATO in various ways don't acknowledge these threats and present solutions to them. And I think one really important aspect that NAVI could help address is bring business executives into the conversation. They have incredible insights that are rarely listened to and accommodated, or listened to or heard or engaged with within NATO circles.
Actually, thank you for that great suggestion. We try to integrate as NAVI people from academia, people from the policy world, retired generals, but we have honestly never thought about incorporating business executives. So we will look into that in our maybe our next speaker series might be with a and we're open to suggestions, by the way. So by the way, I think we want to switch over. So we actually do started covering some of the questions in the Q&A. There are some amazing questions in the Q&A. I wanna combine some of those questions on our plan about the next discussion, because we didn't talk about the social dimensions in Gen Z yet. So actually there is a question from Urorak who kind of alludes to that a little bit. I mean, on one hand, yeah, there's a decline in global trade, but some researchers suggest that the global flow of services, ideas, information, and also this digitized world, given the AI revolution. Based on this, can one say that the globalization is simply changing its form, becoming more intangible and digital? I want to tie this with what you define as what is next to come, because you define that globalization as we know it is over, and it'll be a slow process. It will take a couple of decades, and that would give about 2 decades to Gen Z, who you expect are the ones who will be the ones to build globalization 2.0. So can you combine that with Ur's question about is this globalization 2.0 a completely new form, or is it like more intangible, more digital form of globalized world?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. So it will definitely be more intangible because the digital revolution will have kept advancing. But an interesting aspect of that is 6G. So 6G is being made as we speak. 10 years ago, it would have been, there was no doubt that any such undertaking would be completely cross-border, involving both China and Western countries, because these were the leading countries in this race. And now such an undertaking, which will define essentially communications infrastructure and beyond, it's not going to be possible to do it sort of collaboratively. And I wonder, and I keep monitoring this. Will we have to decide between sort of 6G, Chinese 6G and Western 6G? So that's the first part. But manufacturing will continue. We all need practical or tangible goods for our daily lives. And what we're seeing with intangible parts of globalization is essentially the same trend as we have seen with manufacturing, but a little bit different. So if we look at social media, essentially the crowning achievement of the globalized economy, it's Western social media is famously or infamously not available in China. And so we already have a divided world there. And the battle over TikTok is part of the the de-globalization trend, right? I mean, 10 years ago, it mattered not one bit where TikTok was owned. And now this has, TikTok is the subject of a showdown in the US Congress. So even though technology is basically intangible, the execution of the technology, not the hardware, obviously, but the execution of it is intangible. But even that is now part of this dividing world. And I wonder how Gen Z will address this. It will be interesting to see how their thinking has evolved in 20 years' time, whether they conclude that it's not possible to have the sort of world that we dreamt of in the 90s, or whether they will say, well, now we have had a period of separation. Now let's have another go. I think the latter, and I think what they will do, though, and those of us who are around in 20 years' time, which I hope all three of us will be, is that we will try globalization again, but on a less ambitious basis, so not assuming that we'll have this harmony with all our trading partners, but just pursue globalization as a handshake rather than an embrace, and not assume that countries will want to become like us, but also not assume that they will always trade fairly, and as a result not make ourselves as dependent on them as we did in this first round.
Thank you, Elisabeth. As you know, we have an upcoming election, US election this year, and we have a question about that. What would be your take on potential outcomes of this election?
Yeah, I think regardless of the outcome, the trend towards separation from China is irreversible. And it was interesting to see, even in the most recent election, Biden and Trump both competed to position themselves as anti-globalization candidates. It really is extraordinary. But what is, I think, will be really fascinating to see after the election, regardless of who wins, is how they can execute this reduction in dependence on China and bringing jobs back. And I think a good indicator of that is the IRA, so the Inflation Reduction Act, which was essentially put together collectively by the Biden administration and Congress, in massive incentives package for green manufacturing to set itself up in America. So that reduces U.S. dependence on China, creates green jobs, creates jobs in America, and helps the green transition. What's not to like? Well, Arizona, which has been the protagonist in trying to attract such investment, has done extremely well, but now they can't find enough workers. And so it comes back to this, I think, really important aspect. You have to have the citizens with you, or otherwise your globalization will fail. And indeed, even your de-globalization will fail, because without workers, manufacturing clearly doesn't work.
Thank you so much. By the way, we're almost at time, but as I can glean from the enthusiasm in the Q&A, if you don't mind, we might go a little bit, and maybe we can address some of the, we can get some short answers to some of the questions before we want to end with a positive note about what you, because you actually argue in the book that there will be a globalization 2.0 built by Gen Z, and that will be better. But I'll leave that as the last question. Before that, you kind of address some of these, but I want to ask some short questions from chat. So Zafar asks, how do you think current conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza affect the arguments in your book? You did say that the war in Ukraine just confirmed your thesis. What's your take on the effect of the war in Gaza on your thesis?
Yeah, so it doesn't have an immediate effect, but the effect that it has had is to further weaken globalization, because as we all know, the Houthis have, for I would argue, disingenuous reasons, used Gaza as a as an opportunity to position themselves internationally. And how have they done that? Well, by attacking global shipping, and not just any shipping from the West, whereas Russian and vessels linked to Russia and China sail unaffected through the Red Sea. So there again, it's another sort of nail in the coffin of globalization, affecting companies that haven't done anything to provoke anybody. They're just going about their business as they have for the past 20, 30, 40 years, and yet they are being targeted on the basis that they are from a particular country. And this is a massive learning curve for Western linked companies, that they can be targeted based on where they are based on where they are headquartered. And so no more citizens of nowhere or corporate citizens of nowhere. And this is a radical, steep learning curve for Western executives.
All right, thank you so much. Hassan, do you want to take a question from Q&A? Do you want me to just keep asking some of the short questions that I noticed?
Yeah, I think we have covered, almost all of them. But lastly, we can ask her suggestions, to policymakers for, to tackle these challenges of new era.
I think that would be very much in line with Mehmet Yalınalp's question. And as he happens to be a former Air Force general who worked at NATO, and I know him personally, I think I should have brought this question in. So he asked a very similar question to what just you said. What are the opportunities in this new era? How could people with similar mindsets about the global spread of democratic values and economic prosperity use these opportunities to make a positive change, if you will?
That is an excellent question. What is the forum where they can present their ideas? And it's not the World Economic Forum, which has become so associated with the so-called global elite that it would be, I think, pretty hard to reposition it. What is the alternative forum? It's such an excellent question that, General, I will have to come back to you. I don't know whether that forum yet exists. I'm pretty sure it doesn't. But one thing that I would flag up is that the conversation between policymakers and business leaders is crucial to both keeping our economies safe and also getting early indications of where something is not going right. So Western governments can't be everywhere all the time, and not even their intelligence services can be everywhere all the time. And intelligence services obviously have a particular focus, and it's not economic activities. And so I think now that Western, not just the geographic West, but the wider Western alliance or family is facing these new threats, it would be useful to have a regular dialogue with business leaders whose companies are present in some of these countries and territories, including the Red Sea, that are becoming very complicated. And so the sharing of ideas could happen there. And then, of course, there should be some sort of exchange of ideas with ordinary citizens. But General, I'll have to come back to you with more specific ideas.
All right. Thank you so much. So we have another one. Actually, I want to tie this up to your vision about globalization 2.0. So Engin asks, actually, so he asked, although the problems with globalization were apparent, and we still end up being here with a shattering globalization. I mean, actually, you're not the first one who points out problems with globalization. Economists have been pointing out this for more than 2 decades. I mean, I remember most notably Joseph Stiglitz in his 2002 book, Globalization and Its Contents. Like they have been, we could add people like Paul Krugman, Acemoglu, even Dan Roderick, who are pointing out, all of which are economists. But you actually declare that now globalization is that, like I don't know if it would be correct to define your book as an eulogy speech. I didn't really get a sense that you were a fan or not against. Yeah, how would you define that? Like,
yeah, so I'm not saying it's dead, but I'm saying that there is a widespread loss of faith in it, and that really matters, because figures and statistics, they can go up and down, but once people have lost faith in something, then it's very hard to revive it. And loss of faith is intangible, right? I mean, what causes loss of faith? It can be something that is unrelated to the advantages and disadvantages of that thing. But people can still decide that this is not working anymore. And so I hope that this experience with globalization has taught us that no undertaking by any country can be done without involving the public, and it's cumbersome, and why should politicians have to involve the public more than at regular elections, and the people have unsophisticated arguments apparently and so forth. Well, it does pay off, I think, to involve the public, if only to show up and explain what it is they are planning to. And also, I think a really important thing is that business leaders have to listen to the public. They are so used to just being amongst themselves within their companies. Well, turns out that people's opinions about their companies matter too, and we saw that most vividly after the invasion of Ukraine, when Western, not just Western, social media users around the world launched hashtag campaigns against companies that were still doing business in Russia. And that is incredibly harmful to a company's reputation. And so you could say, as a company that was targeted, well, why was I targeted when such and such company does much more business in Russia? Well, they descended on you, and so it's your problem. And so I think companies need to be aware of that citizen power too.
So you say it's about winning the hearts and minds of people. Yeah.
You summarized what I was trying to say in 5 minutes, you summarized in 5 seconds. So thank you for that.
Okay, yeah, he's a great summarizer. I've known him for a long time. So let's finish. This must be the last question, and let's finish with some of the conclusions in your book, and let's actually try to finish on a positive note. We don't want to draw too much of a gloomy picture here. So you actually argue that you have faith in Gen Z, that they're in their ability to build globalization 2.0, and you argue that the new form of globalization that Gen Z will build needs to take into consideration what was neglected from the post-Cold War globalization, or globalization 1.0, which they should take into consideration citizens' views, job losses, friction among trading partners, need for an even playing field, which is something actually brought forward by almost all the economics, unequal benefits, and climate change. So let's say, what makes you hopeful about Gen Z, and what makes you hopeful? What are some things that make you hopeful that we all, most notably Gen Z, can build a better globalization in the future?
It is that globalization really has been a brilliant concept, and has done so much good, and it created so much prosperity, and we all enjoy living in this kind of economy. It's just not perfect, and that's why people have lost faith in it. And so I think we all want to see something similar, because it has so many benefits. And so when it comes to Gen Z or Gen Z, what is interesting about them is, and now I'm generalizing, is that they are much more activist in their thinking. I think our generation was. They want companies to do the right thing, and that often leads to dilemmas, because what is the right thing from my perspective may be the wrong thing to do from your perspective. And I was talking actually to an executive the other day who's head of government relations as a very large US-based company, and he said, I spend as much time solving geopolitically linked conflicts within the company as I do speaking with foreign governments, and that's how opinionated people have become. But then Gen Z may not have the perfect answers, but we've got to have faith that both our generation and the next generation will want to create a world that is better than the current one is at the moment. And the most important imperative there really is climate change. It's an issue that we won't be able to neglect, and it does require the involvement of every country on this planet.
Ibrahim, I believe she has faith in Gen Z because they are very lucky because they have professors like you, you know.
Oh my God, so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Like, I mean, should I say also yourself? Like, sorry for too much self-flattering here. So thank you so much, Elisabeth. I think we're well over time. I just want to close up reminding that we will give out three copies of your book, based on a draw of Q&A and all attendees that we have, and we will declare the winners tomorrow. And 2 of the other 5 pre-books will go to people who have engaged with our social media posts. Thank you so much for being here with us, and we appreciate your time and your insights about the new world that we are up to.
Thank you, and thank you for the excellent questions from you and from the participants.
Thank you, Elisabeth. It will be a great pleasure for us to invite you to join NAVI as a fellow researcher as well.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you so much to you and to all our viewers. Have a great rest of your day.